Welcome back to the Fullerton College Pre-Press class. This is Professor Hewitt, and we are picking up where we left off talking about PDF creation. This is now talking about the different types of image compression available in a PDF distiller. Some of these are going to be a little bit refreshing to things we've looked at in the past. Some will be a bit new. First, we have zip compression. Zip compression is not the same as LZW. It works on ways of compressing images that have lots of single colors or repeating patterns in them that can be broken down and remembered more easily. So instead of remembering, for instance, 20 pixels of black, it can remember black and then, oh yeah, put that in 20 pixels. That is a difference in a computer, by the way. It's rather than saying this is black, this is black, this is black, this is black, it says all these are black. And it's a way of saving space on the computer. Some programs offer multiple options between 4 and 8-bit compression. So zip can be lossless, which means you can make the image smaller without losing any quality if you are using 4-bit zip compression on 4-bit images or 8-bit compression on 4 or 8-bit. Those two types do not destroy the image at all. They simply organize it better and save it smaller. However, zip becomes lossy if you force 8-bit data down to 4-bit compression. If the compression number is bigger than the bit data number, you have problems. Speaking of problems, JPEGs. JPEGs are designed to lose data in order to make them smaller. JPEGs were invented for digital photography and the budding use of computer networks back in the 80s and 90s, and they were developed really to make images smaller at all costs. They went for some very interesting science, some very interesting math of how to go around downsampling an image and removing information to a minimum necessary level for human recognition. What does it take for a person to recognize a series of pixels as a picture, and how much can we get away with not representing it in perfect detail? It's good for what it's good for. It's not great for printing, though. But it's okay as long as you don't do too aggressive compression to it. Remember that the more compression, the smaller you try to make your file from JPEG use, the worse it'll get. The larger you keep it, the better it is, because the more you compress it, the more data you're throwing away to fit it in. So Acrobat allows various levels of JPEG compression. Note that a PDF is not a JPEG and doesn't even really technically contain JPEGs, but in its weird container file format, the images inside can be compressed using JPEG compression algorithms. You probably won't even see a difference, by the way. If you use medium or high level JPEGs, it will go ahead and compress it. But if your images were close to the right size to begin with, and it compresses them ever so slightly to be a slightly smaller file size, they're still going to be 300 dpi at the size you want, because that's how you built your file in the first place, right? JPEG 2000 is a different type of thing, and it is not exactly a replacement for a JPEG. It's a different type of compression. It didn't really catch on all that much. So this might be the first place you're hearing about it. It was a thing for a while as an improved JPEG. It's basically a different algorithm that does similar things to JPEG algorithm for compressing, and it has lossless as a possibility. It's more efficient, and it's compatible only with the more recent versions. Or it was in 2010. Automatic compression will choose, based off the image itself, what to do. Images with sharp transitions between black and white, light and dark, and just hard edges will get zipped, because that way it'll preserve those things without messing them up. Remember in our zoom in picture of the airplane, for what JPEGs do when JPEGs attack, like my clickbait title there, we saw that around the sharp edges, you started to get some really weird outliers of pixels existing where they shouldn't. You have an airplane flying in a light sky, and suddenly you have dark pieces hovering around the outside edge of the plane. And what's going on there? That's JPEG compression, because it takes a sample of 16 pixels or so and says, yeah, it's mostly this, and kind of creates mostly that instead of creating exactly that. Anyways, so for things that want to have sharp edges and sharp transitions, you use a zip, and otherwise, if it's a more mushy image, mushy is the technical term, it'll make it a JPEG compression if you're not going to notice it. Sampling. So sampling means you are averaging and removing pixels from raster images. What that means is you're taking larger images and you're funneling it down until it's smaller. It's possible to put a picture into a print file that's too big. Possible. I don't think I've ever seen it in the wild, but I saw it once at school, but someone was trying to break my system, and that's different. That was someone kind of testing the limits of what the machines could do. So they created a super image file that was too big for our processors. Turns out it's possible. However, I've never seen a client in a real job give me a picture that was too big, but if they do, downsampling will take an image that's 400 dots per inch and reduce it to the 300 necessary, so you're not wasting extra file space and therefore computer processing time in printing it. You have options for average, subsampling, and bicubic. Bicubic is kind of the default these days. These are the ones you want to choose. Bicubic downsampling, down to 300 dots per inch for anything bigger than 300 dots per inch. And for monochrome images, not even grayscale, but monochrome, if it's black and white, meaning there are black pixels and there are white pixels and no gray pixels in between, if it is an old school bitmap, monochrome, you set that thing up using 1200 dots per inch for anything above 1200. Anything smaller than 1200 and you're not going to get a clean image out of that. Because remember, if you're doing a photograph with lots of shades of gray and in between colors in it, then some of the softer edge, some of the edges, some of the weird transitions kind of disappear into the overall picture. But when all you have is black lines against a white background or the other way around, there's nowhere to hide the weird pixels. There's nothing to distract the viewer from every single tiny imperfection. So those need to be a much higher resolution for people not to notice. And they use the CC-ITT Group 4 compression instead. So, font availability. In order to put fonts into it, Distiller has to have access to them. It can get them from multiple places. It's possible that it will pull them from the Postscript data, and it's also possible to pull them from the system that's running the Distiller using the font locations. Font embedding. You should always turn on font embedding. It is okay and legal to do so if it's being used for printing and not being used for new graphic design down the road. It's not legal to just share fonts to people. I know sharing sounds like stealing, but in some cases, people who do their work and actually create these typefaces need to earn their paychecks for doing it so they can continue to dedicate their lives to making beautiful letter forms. Otherwise, they're going to have to get a day job driving buses or something, and the quality of fonts is going to go down that's out there. Anyways, so you do need to embed them. Anything not embedded becomes substituted. And remember, we don't like substitutes in our food. That whole famous lawsuit of 100% beef. Well, the beef that was beef was 100% beef. Yeah, there's no beef in that. That doesn't work. And it really doesn't work in fonts. Substitution is always a bad thing. So embed your fonts. Make sure they're embedded. Font substitution. Again, scary things can happen. Acrobat can substitute fonts if it can't find the right one, or if the wrong folder is not seen by the thing, or if Type Manager can't figure out what font it is or where it is. It creates a substitute by referencing some masters and tries to find something that's somewhat similar. This is also the kind of trap my family fell into many years ago on a family vacation when I was a kid. And we flew to Chicago and drove across the Midwest. And anyways, we rented a car. We were supposed to get this one super cool van that we could all fit in because I have a lot of siblings. And we're like, all right. And it said this van or similar on the description of the car rental place. When we got there, it was a Chevy Astro that was smaller than the van that was supposed to come, though it has the same number of seats. The air conditioning was bollocks in the back, and it was not a good situation. And that became a joke in my family, the something or similar, and that's a problem with fonts too. People are particular about their typeface choices. If you're using Baskervilles because you know that you need that typeface for that extra believability, that credibility it gives you. If you're using Helvetica, you want the approachable human yet corporate and authoritative look. If you are using Comic Sans, you really want to lose every shred of personal dignity that you had for yourself and the reader. Wait, was that out loud? Anyways, and if that gets converted into some other thing that's kind of similar, you're losing a lot of punch there. It's like replacing beautiful artwork at an art museum with stock photography. Gah, don't do it. Just don't do it. And here's another problem with it. They don't quite match, especially if you're using non-standard fonts. If you're using anything kind of novelty or interesting that's supposed to look like script or black letter or particular lettering types, if you're doing something historical, you're trying to make it look like a certain type of printing from a certain era, like an old Victorian circus poster, which, believe me, I'm not joking about. Those are really cool. They got some beautiful typography going on in those things. I love it. It's so ornate, so overwrought. But anyways, you can end up with a really terrible substitution that kind of follows more or less what it looks like. The visual here shows some of the nightmare. The other half of the nightmare, and I don't remember if this shows it or not, it doesn't, is spacing. You can see in this picture that the bottom awful not script, yuck, that hurts to look at. That bottom one does not take up the same amount of space as the top one. That is a huge issue, more than you realize. If the text changes size, or if the text changes spacing between characters slightly, you could have had a beautifully typeset paragraph that fit into a perfect amount of a page that suddenly leaks onto another page and forces everything to new page breaks and ruins the entire layout, all because a font wasn't embedded properly. I've caught these problems before in the wild. They do happen. And some of the scarier ones are the ones where you use a typeface that has the same name as other typefaces. The typeface that gives me the most PTSD when I'm pre-pressing is Times New Roman. I know it seems like an unassuming, innocuous, safe font, but there are so many versions of it out there, so many sub-variants. Everybody and their uncle has made their own version of Times Roman, Times New, New Times, New Roman, or even just calling it Times New Roman themselves. And though they all look about the same, there are very, very, very tiny differences between them that cause them to totally cripple a print job if the wrong one gets substituted by accident, especially because you may have included one, but then you didn't embed it, and the computer that receives it says, oh yeah, times, I know what that is, I'll just throw in times. Well, the other computer's times may be a different version of the same one, and then your spacing's off and you lose everything, and the whole thing just kind of falls apart, all because you didn't embed your fonts. Embed your fonts. Some fonts can't be embedded. Some of them have restrictions built into the coding that says, do not embed me. Typically speaking, if you can't embed it in a PDF, that means it's not worthy to print. Sometimes that's a copyright restriction to make you buy the full version, and you should if that's the case. Other times it's just was never meant to print. Distiller can tell you if it can't be embedded. It can give you a report on this. Pay attention to this. If the license doesn't permit it, that means you need to acquire a license through legal channels, preferably. No embedding means no good PDF. In fact, they recommend that you go on there and you set up your embedding thing that if you can't embed, cancel the job. Don't even bother making a PDF with substitute fonts. You are wasting everybody's time doing that. Go ahead and get the fonts you need and make sure they're functional before you get there.